the Russians have made it clear from the beginning that they're not going to stop the war. They're going to continue to wage the war until they achieve their objectives. One should therefore expect them to continue to launch air attacks against Ukraine and to continue to push forward on the battlefield. So there's nothing surprising here about what the Russians are doing. It doesn't represent any great change in their policy. What's going on, of course, is that you have a propaganda war that's taking place side by side with the actual war. And all of the complaints and all of the attention that's being given to these Russian attacks in the West is part and parcel of the propaganda war. What they're trying to do is make it look like the Russians are ruthless murderers, and the Russians, are the principal obstacle to peace, not the Europeans and the Ukrainians. And the fact is that the West and the Ukrainians are quite good at the propaganda war. The big problem they face is that the war that counts is the real war, the one on the battlefield, the one that involves these missile and airstrikes. And in that war, the Ukrainians are in deep trouble, and the situation just gets worse each day. So, you can just largely ignore this propaganda war because in the final analysis, it just doesn't mean much.
Now, let me ask you, speaking of the propaganda war and the claims made by the two sides, you have the Russian side claims, again, overnight, that they don't attack civilian infrastructure. They go after energy infrastructure, but otherwise it's military targets. And they claim that last night's attacks were into military structures. But at least of those pictures that you saw Gary showing there, seem to be a lot of houses and apartments and non-military buildings. What do you make of that?
I don't know what to say, Danny. I mean, I agree with your assessment of the pictures, and I've searched to see if I can figure out what the Russians are saying about the particular targets they're going after, but they're not saying anything explicit. So it's hard to know whether they were going after real targets and this was just collateral damage, or they've decided to take off the gloves and go after civilian targets. It seems to me that they're not waging what I would call a punishment campaign, where they're out to kill large numbers of civilians and do huge amounts of damage to apartment buildings and living places. Because if they were, they would end up killing more people. They are not killing that many people. It's regrettable that any people are killed, any civilians are killed, but they're not killing many civilians. This doesn't look like your normal punishment campaign, where thousands of people are killed in one evening's worth of strikes. So it may be collateral damage. But again, it's just very hard to say, given that both sides are engaged in a propaganda war, and given that, people like us, as close as we follow this conflict, just don't know that much about a good number of issues.
Yeah, I know that at various points in the war we've seen where some of the air defense interceptor missiles that didn't hit the target later came down in the city. That was actually fairly common, at least earlier in the war, that I had seen specific reports of. There's also the possibility that Russian missiles can simply be off target, hit the wrong thing. And then there's also some that the Russians admitted to, and this has been about 6 or so months since I last saw a report like this, to where they said, yeah, because you had military forces in that place. We know you did. And so it was a civilian building, an apartment building, and we hit it intentionally because that's where you had military forces. I've actually talked to one person, a British NGO person who was on the ground in Ukraine earlier in the war, and said they firsthand saw that frequently the Ukraine side would put military forces into civilian areas, to try to hide them or whatever. I think according to the laws of war, that's actually legal, but then it makes it a target. Now, I can't say that that's the case here. In fact, I have no idea at all. But it wouldn't surprise me if any of those, or maybe Russia is actually just trying to take out some civilian targets for some purpose. It's hard for me to say, but bottom line is, as long as this war continues to go on, this kind of destruction will continue one way or the other.
Well, Danny, what if you had a situation where you had 150 NATO advisors who were in Ukraine, they're in Kyiv, and they went out for breakfast at a restaurant? And the Russians hit that restaurant and they killed all those NATO people. that would be, I think, a legitimate military strike. It wouldn't be an attack on civilians. Of course, in the process, they would invariably end up killing civilians. So that may be what happened in some of these cases. I'm not saying it did. Again, it's very hard to know exactly what's going on here because, again, we're dealing with a propaganda war on both sides.
Indeed. Yeah, that's why it is so hard to cut through some of this stuff. We can only see what did happen. And we can only left to speculate on what may have been the reason behind it, et cetera. Before we leave the whole topic of the Russian air war, I want to look at an interesting thing because this may fit into your theme of propaganda war. Because when you look at the number of Russian drones, especially in recent months, they have significantly increased in frequency and in the number of going through, as well as the type of drones being used for these long-range strikes are increasing in their sophistication. Here is one, and I think this was the Wall Street Journal that was publishing this. This is the number of drones and missile strikes in a day, and it shows that the number of those that were intercepted by the Ukraine side or claimed to be, and those that were not intercepted. In this chart that people probably can't read a lot of this stuff, but you see this, the mainly the yellow or gold color is what Ukraine claims that they intercepted, in the small purple area that's kind of on the top of each of these clips is what Ukraine claims and end up getting through. It seems to me that the claims that they're shooting down virtually everything is a little bit spurious when I see so many targets actually getting hit. And the interesting thing is that the number of drones that got through that Ukraine claims almost doesn't change if there's just a handful of missiles firing or if there's a huge number of missiles firing. In fact, you can see the biggest spike in the middle of that toward the middle or so of July when I believe there was like 700 fire. You see that according to Ukraine, every one of them were shot down, but just tiny little dot of purple at the top. But then meanwhile, when you look at some of the lower spikes, they show that sometimes a pretty substantial number of purple gets through. So I'm not sure how those things fit together, but it just goes to show, at least to me, that you really can't believe what anybody's saying that you can't physically validate on the ground.
Well, I think, Danny, this fails the common sense test. I mean, we know that the Russians, by Ukrainian accounts, have significantly increased the number of drones that they're firing at Ukraine. And you saw that, of course, on the chart. And furthermore, by Ukrainian accounts, the quality or the lethality of those drones has gone up over time. And at the same time, the ability of the Ukrainians to defend themselves has deteriorated over time. The Ukrainians again say this. So if all those things are true, how can the Ukrainians be shooting down almost all of these massive drones that are being launched at them on a nightly basis? It just doesn't make any sense. And then I'd come at this from a slightly different angle. When I look at Ukrainian claims about the number of Russians who have died versus the number of Ukrainians who have died in this war, the numbers that the Ukrainians push forward, and of course that the West echoes, make no sense at all. The Ukrainian casualties have to be at least twice as big as the number of Russian casualties, given the deep-seated imbalance in firepower between the two sides, which of course favors the Russians. But nevertheless, the Ukrainians and people in the West claim that the Russians have suffered far more casualties than the Ukrainians. Again, this fails the common sense test, and it tells you that the Ukrainians and their minions in the West are lying. It's the propaganda war. And I think the same basic logic applies with regard to the chart on drones that you just put up.
Yeah, and that's what makes it so hard to parse even truth from fiction, and then that extends into some other areas. So, kind of keeping with the theme of the propaganda war, let's go to what the Europeans are trying to say that they want to get done in this peace process that President Trump has begun. And one of the key areas there's a couple of key ones. One is troops on the ground to peacekeepers to patrol any kind of agreement that is eventually made. And then the second one is security guarantees. That was raised in Kiev, I think it was yesterday, by a British Admiral Radkin. Tony Radkin, I think his name is, Gary. Yeah, up there, and thank you. It says the UK and France have made it very clear that this is our commitment. We will look for opportunities for a military presence in Ukraine. We want to support Ukraine, ensure European aircraft in your skies, guarantee safe skies for you, and join Turkey, Romania, Bulgaria in ensuring security in the Black Sea. So Great Britain and France are clearly saying this, and we are negotiating with other partners about their level of commitments in terms of providing security guarantees with troops. What chance does this have to fly in any kind of a negotiated that the Russians would agree to?
Well, if we're saying that there's going to be a peace settlement, this is an agreement that both the Russians sign on to and the Ukrainians in the West sign on to. There are going to be no meaningful security guarantees from the West. And there are going to be no boots on the ground in Ukraine. So you can't have a meaningful peace agreement and at the same time have NATO troops in Ukraine. It just doesn't work. What that tells you is the only way you're going to get NATO troops into Ukraine is if you get a ceasefire, which I don't think you're going to get, and you put those troops in there. And once you put those troops in there, the Russians have made it clear that they're going to put their gun sights on those troops. And the question is, in that fight between NATO troops and Russian troops, who do you think is going to prevail? And if I had to bet, I'd bet on the Russians, especially if you're talking about putting the British and the French and other European troops in there, because they don't have large numbers of troops and the quality of their troops leave much to be desired. The British don't even have the equivalent of one armored division. I sort of don't understand what these people are talking about. But of course, what they're talking about is not using these troops to fight against the Russians. But as I said to you before, they're not going to be able to get a peace agreement. We're not going to be able to get a peace agreement with the Russians that allows for security guarantees or for troops on the ground.